Welcome to Bible Talk class. We are continuing our class presentations on letter Pauline and Catholic Epistles, and we are beginning with introductory issues to the Pastoral Epistles. And the presentation today will cover authorship, date, destination, occasion, purpose, adoption into the canon, content, contributions of the Pastoral Epistles. Subscribe to this channel if you are yet to be a member of our talk class, and share this video and many others that we have prepared for your study. And like this video and the rest of the videos that we have. The more you like, the more the world will know that we are here to help explain the Bible and guide believers and even non-believers to understand the Bible in its context. And finally, and look at theological themes of the Pastoral Epistles. Let's begin. D.N. Burdott in 1703 and Paul Anton in 1726 named the two epistles to Timothy and Titus as pastoral epistles, hereafter referred to as P, due to their pastoral ministry concerns. This name is challenged because the epistles are not concerned with pastoral duties. It is universally recognized that 1 Timothy contains some church ministry information. Some pastoral concerns are found in 1 Timothy. That is a fact. But that cannot be said of 2 Timothy and Titus, because these are more personal letters. Contemporary scholarship insists that the P was written by someone other than Paul because of the unique style, vocabulary, church order, and doctrinal orthodoxy concerns. And so there are doubts about Pauline authorship of these three books. So let's look at the concerns that have been raised by contemporary scholarship. First is vocabulary argument. So let's look at argument and respond to each of the arguments. Some scholars have noted that the PE, Pastoral Epistles, contains 902 words, of which 54 are proper names. Out of 848, that is, if you subtract 54 from 902 words, you have 848. Out of the 848, 306 are not used in the 10 Pauline writings. The 10 Pauline writings here are Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and Philemon. Of the 306 words, at least 175 occur nowhere in the New Testament. Of the 306, 211 are found in 2nd century works of apostolic fathers and apologists. Therefore, the author of the Pastoral Epistles belonged to the 2nd century period, and that it wasn't Paul who lived in the 1st century. That is the argument they are making. So these scholars continue to say that if you subtract the 306 from the 848, you arrive at 542. 542 words are found in P and Pauline writings, that is the 10 letters of Paul that we have mentioned, of which 50 are characteristically Pauline. In short, these scholars are saying that out of the 902 words, 542 words are found in P and Pauline writings. And that, if you are to be very keen in your assessment, you will say that only 50 are strictly Pauline. Therefore, the author cannot be Paul. Let's respond briefly here. The words shared by both PE and 2nd century writers are found in other writings before AD 50. The argument is simple, is that if you say that the words found in PE are also found in 2nd century writings, therefore the author of PE belonged to the 2nd century period. It's a fair argument. However, we see that some of these words are also found in writings before AD 50 in the 1st century. It means this argument is not strong enough to kick Paul out of the possible candidates of authorship. Next response is that the use of the same words in PE and other Pauline writings with different meanings can be attributed to context. It's very clear. It is misleading to say that 306 occur only in PE because 1 Timothy has 127, as 2 Timothy and Titus have 81 and 45 respectively. So we should not say that 360 occur in PE. No, they are distributed among the three, and each letter has its own share, and that has to be made clear. The argument of style. It is argued that 112 particles, prepositions, and pronouns are found only in the 10 letters of Paul, but not in the PE, meaning the 10 letters have unique style of writing, and the PE does not conform or does not have these particles, prepositions, and pronouns unique to the 10. Therefore, the author cannot be Paul. The second argument is that PE has little mercurial argument compared to the 10. When you read the 10 Pauline epistles, you see Paul changing his mood. It's quite moody in the 10 epistles of Paul. We don't see Paul changing his tone and his emotions in the Pastoral Epistles. Therefore, Paul did not write this argument. Response. We also have seen 93 particles, prepositions, and pronouns, all except one appearing in the PE, and all except 7 in the 10 Pauline epistles. We have mentioned that some scholars have identified 112 particles, prepositions, and pronouns occurring in the 10 epistles of Paul, but not in the PE. Therefore, Paul did not write. A more careful assessment of the use of particles and prepositions and pronouns has revealed that we have 93 particles, prepositions, and pronouns, all shared by both PE and the 10 Pauline epistles. So, if 112 and 93 particles, prepositions, and pronouns are put together, out of the 205, meaning if you put the two together, you arrive at 205 particles, prepositions, and pronouns. Out of the 205, 92 occur in the PE, as 131 in Romans, 113 in 2 Corinthians, 86 in the Philippians, and so forth. Therefore, both the PE and the 10 epistles of Paul share almost the same particles, prepositions, and pronouns. Now, to say that in the Pastoral Epistles, Paul is not seen as Mercurian, not changing his mood, is a bit straightforward. You don't see him changing compared to the 10 epistles of Paul. That is because of context. The context determines the mood or the mode of argument that an author uses as he addresses issues that have been posed to him. And so context is a determinant of mood. Historical problems. There's this argument that the life of Paul from Acts and the 10 Pauline epistles cannot be situated in the historical setting of the PE. In short, we don't find Paul in the book of Acts going to the island of Crete to preach the gospel. And so when you read in the letter to Titus that Titus was in Crete and Paul was writing to him in Crete, it seems weird because you don't find that information in Acts. Therefore, Paul cannot be the author of the Pastoral Epistles. Response: Acts ends with Paul in prison in Rome, but with a possible release, and that's why we assume here that Paul was released, and as he planned to visit the church in Philippi, he passed through Crete, because on his way to Rome, they stopped briefly at Crete, and he saw that people were there who also needed the gospel. But because of time and constraint, he could not. But on his way to Philippi, he stopped and preached the gospel, and when he could not finish, he asked Titus to continue what he had started. And so there was possibility of release from Roman imprisonment, and also possibility of evangelization in Crete. We do not have several details. The reason why it's important to appreciate these historical gaps, in Paul's writings and also in the book of Acts, is that there are certain things that are mentioned by Paul that are not referenced or mentioned in the book of Acts. And doesn't mean that because they are not mentioned in the Acts, those things did not happen. For example, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 to 27, Paul mentions the number of times that he was beaten. And we don't find this reference in Acts. It doesn't mean that Paul was never beaten or persecuted. The fact that Acts does not give or tell us everything that happened to Paul doesn't mean that when Paul makes any reference in his own writings, those things should not count. That is not a good assessment of the biblical data. We must be fair and let the Bible speak as has been delivered to us. The personal references render support for historical peculiarities and credibility of the author. When you read 1 Timothy, you see Paul mentioning people's name, mentioning the mother and the grandmother of Timothy, also mentioning a place where Timothy was and people that he had to engage, people that Paul even had removed from the faith, mentioned their names. These names mentioned in these writings suggest that the author was addressing real human beings, and therefore the Pastoral Epistles can be considered as a historical document. The problem of heresy. This argument, the false teachings in the PE belong to the 2nd century Gnostic system. When you read in particular 1 Timothy chapter 4 verse 3, Paul mentions the rise of false teaching in latter days. Now, some have suggested that looking at the nature of the false teaching that Paul presents, it belongs to the 2nd century. And our response is very simple. The false teachings described in the PE do not fully portray the full-blown Gnosticism of the 2nd century. The Gnosticism of the 2nd century was very matured one. A teaching that through knowledge one could be saved, one could save the soul and liberate one's soul from this prison of physical body. This teaching was very much matured in the 2nd century, not in the 1st century. So what Paul presents is not a 2nd century Gnosticism. And that's the point we want to stress. The ecclesiastical organization problem. The issue here is that 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus present a picture of a church that was well organized, and therefore Paul cannot be the author, because in the 1st century there was no organized church. So the well-organized church with an ordained ministry portrayed in the PE does not fit in the life setting of Paul. This argument, therefore, the author was not Paul. The ritual of appointing and laying on of hands in the PE describe a more organized system of the 2nd century. Response: Acts, the book of Acts, records an organized church in the life setting of Paul. Acts chapter 14 verse 23 makes this clear. Philippians chapter 1 verse 1 also underscores this point, that Paul wrote to the church in Philippi asking them to give respect to the elders, also sending greetings to the elders, bishops and elders. Now, the laying on of hands was a confirmation in Acts, not ordination, and that the words bishop and elders have the same meanings as found in Philippians chapter 1 verse 1. So in the Pastoral Epistles, we see Paul telling Timothy not to hasten in laying hands on anyone. Paul was only saying that don't confirm anyone. So it wasn't ordination as understood today. That understanding is not what Paul is teaching. And that the word bishop in the first century meant elder, a leader, basically that. In the second century, a bishop had a different meaning, had a broader geographical administrative oversight. But in the first century, it was just a house church administration, about 7 people gathering the church, and a leader called bishop. The Greek word used here simply means a leader, and therefore it should be seen as a moderate administrative title given to one leading the church. And that the idea of church organization is not only found in the PE, it's found elsewhere in the New Testament. Theology. The argument of theology indicates that the author used Hellenistic terms for the salvation event. And so Paul using the idea that you have been ransomed. In other words, Christ came to ransom, to save us. These words are more Hellenistic, the Greek understanding of salvation. And therefore the author cannot be Paul. The idea that the law is good, as recorded in 1 Timothy chapter 1 verses 8 to 9, makes Paul an unlikely candidate for authorship, because Paul never regarded the law as good. The idea of godliness, that the piety urge or the godliness urge by the PE is unusual in the 10, because you don't find the concept of godliness in the 10 epistles of Paul. Therefore, finding this idea of godliness in the PE makes it difficult to accept Paul as the author. A response. The author uses old and new Pauline terms for rhetorical purposes. The words used to convey the idea of salvation are found both in the 10 epistles of Paul and also in the Pastoral Epistles. And they are all words that Paul used interchangeably, and they mean the same thing. They do not convey any idea of Hellenistic. They meant what they meant to the audience, basically that Jesus came to save. And so there's no problem with the use of these terms. The idea of the goodness of the law can still be seen as Pauline. When you read Romans chapter 7 verse 12, Paul says the law is good. So there's no problem with that. Paul, in other writings, urged godliness. So it is not only in the PE that we find the idea of godliness. We find this idea also in Romans chapter 6 verse 17, 2 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 12. Note that an admirer of Paul would not have referred to Paul as chief of sinners and portrayed Paul as lonely. If someone wrote the Pastoral Epistles and attributed them to Paul as the author, that person should be someone who might have loved Paul so much that would have painted Paul as very strong and also a righteous person, a good and kind person. But in these letters, we see the author portraying himself as very weak and not meeting the standard of God, and that he was the chief of sinners. This is not a good brand. And also painting Paul as very lonely. And so it takes someone who has experienced these things to be able to tell what he has experienced. And therefore, Paul still remains the best candidate for the authorship of these books. Now, the idea of pseudonymity, there is argument that some people wrote the Pastoral Epistles and named after Paul. Some other than Paul wrote PE because it was a common practice in ancient times, for instance, in the Jewish apocalyptic writings, Enoch and Moses. Paul even instructed the Thessalonians not to recognize prophecy, report, or letter supposed to have come from us, according to Paul, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 2. suggesting the knowledge of pseudepigraphic letters in the period. In other words, in the first century, some could write letters and named after certain known people so that letters could be accepted. That is what we find. So this feeling was there in the first century. The response is very simple, and that pseudepigraphic letters were rare except the epistle of Jeremy and the letter of Aristeas, which were not really letters because the former was a sermon while the latter an account of the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Flowing from above, it can be said that there was no precedence for the forger of P to follow. In other words, pseudepigraphic letters were extremely rare to inspire. They were rare. They were very rare. Let's continue the response. The early Christians, the church fathers in particular, did not need to attach the names of apostles to their writings. They didn't need to do that. So we have the Gospels, we don't find any names attached to the Gospels. Acts, the same. Hebrews, same. Pauline Epistles, same. The fact that we don't find names attached to these books, but we find the name of Paul in the Pastoral Epistles, suggests that indeed Paul authored these books and that nobody inserted his name, and that the original Greek text that has come to us contains the name of Paul in the Pastoral Epistles. The early church fathers dealt seriously with pseudonymous authors and writings, as evidenced in the Muratorian canon. In the Muratorian canon, we see that some books that were attributed to Paul were rejected. Acts of Paul. And in this Acts of Paul, we find a letter that is attributed to Paul as 3 Corinthians, and also epistle to the Laodiceans. In Colossians chapter 4 verse 16, Paul mentions that he sent a letter to the church in Laodicea, and that church has to send their letter to the church in Colossae. So the church in Colossae will send their letter to the church in Laodicea, and they will also read the letter to the church in Laodicea, more or less to share letters. We don't have this letter anymore, but someone tried to write a letter and attribute it to Paul as the letter to the Laodiceans. And the early church fathers saw this and removed this letter from the canon. So the church was very serious about spurious letters. Serapion, the bishop of Antioch, though allowed the use of the Gospel of Peter, discontinued its use in the 2nd century. Note, it was possible that, to some extent, an epistolary pseudepigraphy happened, but rare. The possibility is there. That's why Paul urged the church in Thessalonica to be very careful about the letters that they read. And that Paul, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 verse 7, indicated that, as you see in all my letters, I have my own signature here. I write my own name to indicate that the letter is coming from me. And so, bear in mind. So Paul was very much aware of the practice of pseudepigraphy, and that is very important to note. In short, the Pastoral Epistles were not pseudepigraphic letters because they contained the name of Paul. And the early church fathers knew and saw how to distinguish between spurious letters and authentic letters. And they considered the Pastoral Epistles as Pauline, hence authentic. Let's move on to the provenance, place of writing. Where was Paul when he wrote? 1 Timothy, the text says that Paul was on his way to Macedonia. So it's possible that when he arrived in Macedonia, then he sent this letter to Timothy. 2 Timothy. Rome could be the place of writing, gleaning from chapter 1, verses 16 to 17, chapter 4, verse 6, verse 16, and that is a picture we find because Paul says that I'm waiting for my execution and I am in Rome. So it's possible that he wrote from Rome. Titus, on the way to or in Nicopolis, could be the place of writing. So Paul left Titus in Crete and told him that he was going to Nicopolis in the province of Achaia. So it's possible that on his way to, or when he got to Nicopolis, he wrote this letter to Titus. Date of writing. If written after his first Roman imprisonment, which happened in AD 62, then it was written in the 60s. It means 1 Timothy was written in early 60s. 2 Timothy. Eusebius claims that Paul was martyred in AD 67, suggesting that 2 Timothy was written in that same year or a year before 67. Titus. Since Paul's ministry is silent in Acts, it seems probable that writing after the first Roman imprisonment, say 60s, but before 2 Timothy took place. So we can say that Paul wrote Titus after his first Roman imprisonment, and that is where we can locate the dating for the letter to Titus. Let's go to destination. Where did Paul send the pastoral letters? 1 Timothy. The letter was meant for Timothy, who was ministering in Ephesus. Yet some of the messages were to be extended to the Ephesian church. So the text is very clear. When you read these passages, you appreciate that Timothy was the primary audience. When you look at the text again, you see that Timothy was to share some information with the church leaders and some members in the church. Therefore, the letter had primary and secondary audience. The primary audience was Timothy. The secondary audience consisted of the church members. 2 Timothy. This was a very personal letter to Timothy, who was possibly in Ephesus. In this letter, Paul addressed Timothy, my son. And so the letter was meant for only Timothy because Paul wanted him to do something for him, and that we'll look at it very soon. So see this as a personal letter that was intended only for Timothy. Titus. The letter was addressed to Titus, who was in Crete. So Titus was the addressee of this letter. Canonization. Were these letters considered canonized or inspired to guide the spiritual work of the early church? Polycarp, Athenagoras, and later apostolic fathers accepted 1 Timothy as Pauline, although Tertian and Marcion rejected it as individuals, but not as representative of the church. 2 Timothy. Polycarp, Arrhenius, Clement of Alexandria, and other apostolic fathers recognized 2 Timothy as Pauline, although Tertian and Marcion rejected it as individuals, but not as representative of the church. 2 Timothy is missing from P46, dated AD 200, probably due to mutilation of the Codex. The book that contains the New Testament writings does not have 2 Timothy. Of course, there are other books also that are not found in this book. Now, this book is named P46 because the writing material was papyrus. It was copied around AD 200 and does not have 2 Timothy. And the reason is that we don't have the complete book. So it's possible that portion had been mutilated. That's why we don't have 2 Timothy. Titus, Clement of Rome, Tertullian, Arrhenius, other apostolic fathers, including Tertian and Muratorian canon, but absent from Marcion's canon and P46. So Titus is found in the writings of these church fathers, except the ones that we have mentioned here, Marcion's canon and P46. Purpose of writing. Occasion in which these letters were written, and also the purpose for their writing. 1 Timothy. Due to Paul's absence, Timothy was to command certain people not to teach false doctrine in Ephesus. There were false teachers roaming in Ephesus, spreading false teaching. and Paul had to censor them and banish them from the church. And so Paul wrote to Timothy to safeguard the faith of the church. That was the purpose. The occasion was false teaching spreading in the church, and Timothy had to deal with the false teaching and the false teachers. 2 Timothy, occasion. Looking forward to his execution, Paul urged Timothy, his beloved young minister, to come to him and to be firm in the faith. Paul was about to die and needed Timothy to come to him and keep him company. At the same time, Paul wanted Timothy to be strong in the faith after his demise. Titus. Due to Paul's absence, Titus was to complete what Paul left undone by appointing elders for the churches in Crete. Paul left Crete and had to go to Nicopolis to get something done, and so needed Titus to continue what he had started. That was the occasion, and the purpose is linked to the occasion, as you have just mentioned in Titus chapter 1 verse 5. So the occasion and the purpose are all found in the text. You can actually read from the references that we have provided here. Contribution. Timothy. Deep affection for a subordinate minister. That is what 1 Timothy teaches. That senior ministers must have deep and honest affection for their subordinate ministers. At the heart of ecclesiastical organization is a quality expected of the overseer and deacons. Every church leader must possess some qualities, which Paul enumerated in 1 Timothy. Decorum in prayer, behavior, and false teachings. Paul emphasized these items in 1 Timothy. The gospel of Jesus Christ should define the content of Timothy's preaching and honor given to elders. These also are highlighted in this letter. 2 Timothy. The letter shows how a Christian martyr should face death. That's the attitude of Paul. I look forward to my death, and I believe that I'll be resurrected and will be rewarded by God. The cost of discipleship is overwhelming, using images of soldiers, athletes, and a hard-working farmer. Salvation is free gift from God, but demanding. This is the message that one gets from 2 Timothy. Titus. Acceptable good quality Christian character is required of all sections of the church, not only leaders. Christian teachers are to press on in spite of false teachings spreading. That should be the attitude. Now the content of 1 Timothy is as follows here. 2 Timothy is also here. And Titus is the content, a summary of the content. Now let's look at the theological themes of PE. Traditional teaching is a theological theme. The teachings about the church and the moral teachings are based on known traditional theological statements, and that teachings must be based on what we already believe, that were presented by Christ and have been passed on by the apostles to us. This is what Paul will say, and this is how we should relate to the truth. The truth should be based on what has been passed on by Christ through the apostles to us. The PE present Paul's doctrine of justification by grace through faith without works. Salvation is mediated through Jesus Christ. The PE draws attention to the gift of the Holy Spirit as source in new birth experience. Jesus and God as a theological theme. The earthly life of Jesus and the parousia, the coming of Jesus Christ, are presented with emphasis as a saving action of God. The first coming of Jesus Christ and the second coming of Jesus Christ are considered as saving actions of God. Jesus is the destroyer of death and hope of resurrection for believers. The life of believers, another theological theme. Through the saving action of God, through Jesus, a person becomes a member of God's family. This salvation ensures a departure from the old life and formation of new life. The new life is a shadow of the eternal life bestowed. The Holy Spirit is the source of this change and transformation in the person. The last theological theme of the PE is the church. The need to pass on true teaching of the gospel in the church is emphasized. The leadership of the church must hold the true teachings of the gospel plus the quality of being leaders. The PE highlights an organized church and gives us a template on how to manage churches, particularly when it comes to organization of churches. Thank you very much for staying with us. In our next presentation, we'll look at the book of Hebrews, a very exciting document. Stay tuned.
Be watchful and wait. Hold fast till I come, sweet promise of them. The kingdom restored to you shall begin. Come and turn.